What's going on? Boys, thanks to our patrons and Fiverr customers, subscribe to our Patreon free for behind-the-scenes stuff. Arm yourselves, life stuff. I don't normally do 2 videos in one day, but I am compelled. I had a dolly zoom moment. Although recent events have concluded, I am still hoovering up as much information about ASPD and sociopaths as I can, both for future events and to make sense of past events. And in one video, this woman said ASPD should be called low affect disorder, not antisocial personality disorder, not sociopathy. Because you know sociopathy is stigmatized as a word, but even ASPD is stigmatized, and these stigmas go deeper than you realize. Because it's like this isn't the example she used, but it's like naming a pit bull Cupcake, or in the inverse, Devastator of Worlds or something. The name alone informs so much of what you think you're dealing with. As in, Cupcake might be a toddler destroyer, and Destroyer of Worlds might be a saint. And even if you know you're informed of what Cupcake actually is, what Destroyer of Worlds actually is, the name still carries or has more of an effect than you think it does. As in, all the ingredients can be ingredients to one recipe, but until the name reflects the recipe and the ingredients, you'll always, at least mentally, get something wrong. And I think that is what's happened with sociopaths, and even antisocial personality disorder, because those 2 words, by default, make you assume evil, default evil, when that is not the case with these people. Now, I'll still use the word sociopath because it's a sexier word, a more powerful word, but low affect disorder suits what I think is going on here a lot better. And it's okay to simp for sociopaths, but simping for lads raises questions. Now, one of the reasons I think low affect disorder works better is behaviors sociopaths are more inclined toward are not born out of some innate evil. Rather, these behaviors or these characteristics are non-socialized, not necessarily anti-socialized. Because anti-socialization in your mind sets up this nemesis system. And I don't think sociopaths are the nemeses of society by default. Rather, they have no qualms doing things socialization would say you shouldn't do, or consensus socialization people would dislike. Like the impulsiveness, like the criminality, which is, again, not all of them are doing criminal shit all the time, and other stuff. And sociopaths will talk about the way they feel compelled to do these things sometimes, even if it's on a small level. But when you consider this in a low affect way and not in a nemesis way, you realize this is another instance they're actually more similar to baseline people than stigma would make you think they are. We talked last time about the way baseline people have all sorts of negative thoughts, but they're socialized, they're receptive to socialization, which is deep brainwashing, not to do these things, but you can't help thinking them, which is something baseline people and socialization are very uncomfortable admitting, that they even have these thoughts, and they probably have them regularly. But take that a step further, because sociopathy, it seems like in childhood, and maybe I'm not super researched on this is just the pattern. It seems to be something happens, something bad, that triggers lack of affect, probably in an emergency self preservation fashion that leads to a failure for the amygdala to develop the way it would in a baseline person. It's a developmental thing. And I bring that up, one, to remember sympathy here, and two, to think back to childhood, back before your amygdala was fully developed, back before socialization had gotten its talons into you totally. As a child, you probably did fucked up things. And I think the same fucked up things sociopaths do. The difference is you were able to develop normally, and you had the expected socialized reaction that from that point on probably stopped you from doing those things again. An example: the woman I was speaking with talked about killing small animals as a child, which sounds really fucked up, really spooky, this oh my god thing. But I have two examples saying that's not as uncommon as you'd think it is. It's the reactions that differ. One, bringing out an Anthony Cumia story, the fucking vampire, the ghoul, he talked about as a child, the same age as this woman when she was a child, taking the lid of a can and grabbing a lizard and bisecting it. So if you stop the story there, you have two examples of two children killing small animals. But going further into Kumia's story, he said the sound the lizard made when he did that disturbed him, and the guilt stopped him from ever doing something like that ever again. Which is, I think, the typically developing amygdala response. I have a story. When I was a kid, about that same age, I took 22 and I went out into the woods and I killed something that you shouldn't be killing with a 22 because it didn't die at first. And because I was a stupid kid and I didn't understand what I was doing, I killed something because I was curious, but it didn't die. So I kept shooting it in its chest and it still didn't die, and it was getting pretty gruesome. And then it finally dawned on me, shoot it in the head, and I did that, and it died, and I can't recall it. Well, no. Vermin hunting is one thing, but even with that, you do it in a different way. I never went out to kill something just to kill something ever again, and in the instances I needed to kill things later, I did it in as clinical a fashion as I could. But even when you think about my story, if you remove context, it still sounds like kid going around killing things, killing small animals. Once again, the difference in my case would be having the baseliner amygdala response, feeling the guilt, not doing that way ever again. But even in the killing stuff thing, expanded out, people don't have a lot of care when they kill insects. They can even be pretty sadistic when they kill insects. And children, how many times on a playground when you were growing up did kids pull the legs off a grasshopper and drop it on an anthill? These are all baseliner, mostly I guess, baseliner children. My point is, these are natural human urges. Killing things out of curiosity, or performing sadism just to do it. Even in adults with the insects thing. It's not that sociopaths are born with some demonic urges. that are unique to them. We're all born with evil, demonic urges. The difference is we develop typically, and our typical reactions to these things become strong enough, you'll probably never do one of those things again. But that doesn't change the fact those urges and those capacities are still there. They were there from the beginning. Even if you've, in adulthood, covered them with nice, obscuring blankets. My point is, sociopaths and baseline humans are, by default, as malevolent as each other. The difference is how you develop and learn to deal with that malevolence. They are humans who were blocked from developing into the typical socialization fashion neurologically, probably because at some point in their childhood they couldn't afford to develop into the social nicety bullshit. And this is a nice segue into another aspect of this low affect thing. Because it is a spectrum, and they do talk about feeling emotions. Maybe in a different way from baseliners, but what is this mystical, mysterious, different way? It seems to be a matter of intensity and socialization. Examples. With intensity, many of them talk about the emotions they do feel feeling muted. Aside from some of the more negative or aggressive emotions, which again, when you think about the developmental thing and why that's there, that makes sense. But then we come to the more important side, I think, which is socialization. Because I'm beginning to think there are two layers of emotions. On the first layer, you have primal emotions. Emotions you feel without or outside the influence of socialization. And then you have socialized emotions, which are trained and twisted versions of primal emotions. Let's think about guilt. Most sociopaths talk about not feeling guilt. Maybe on a cognitive level they understand they shouldn't have done this or that, but they don't feel guilt the way baseline humans do. Now, what is guilt? I think guilt is a synthetic emotion synthesized to make society building easier. Now, although it's synthesized, we have baseliner typically developed amygdalas, and I think of that thing as a fertile field for certain sorts of brainwashing. Guilt is a form of brainwashing that runs as deep as gender does. Which is another thing. Sociopaths and gender, not sex, gender, is odd, and we'll need to do a lot of thinking about that. But their gender identities don't seem to work the way ours do either. They're either, the brainwashing side, I mean, is either not there much at all, or it's a fixation and it's highly performative. Anyway, how is guilt synthesized? Guilt is a manipulated form of fear. I think guilt is the fear of consequences of other people's finding out what you've done and punishing you for it. And you can say that it's not that when you feel guilty, you do feel truly bad for what you did. But again, what you think you feel and what you actually feel are different things, which that's a tricky, slippery slope. But another thing to consider is we live in, at least in the United States, we live in a largely Abrahamic Christian society. Even if you aren't Christian, we are our socialization is founded on these values. They run a lot deeper than you think, too. And the reason I say this is consider the way people don't feel guilt when they do brutal things to groups of people society has deemed it okay to do brutal things to. People don't feel guilty at all. They enjoy it quite a lot, actually. Why don't they feel guilty? Because there won't be any consequences for hurting these people, and they enjoy it because they get to vent these dark urges that everybody has, safely, maybe even be rewarded for it. So guilt is not some inherent spiritual, soulful thing. It is a product of society, of socialization, and the fertile soil that is your typically developed amygdala. Being normal seems usually to mean being more susceptible to consensus influence and brainwashing. And we go through guilt here to make the point, or to make the distinction between these more socialized, manipulated emotions and these primal emotions. I think sociopaths do have emotions, but they're the primal forms, which, because we're so socialized, look alien to us and are baffling to them most of the time. Because even though they're operating with these primal emotions, those are muted. They're much quieter until shit ramps up and they break out. But even in those instances, they're mostly flying blind, because they're dealing with forms of emotions we don't have a lot of literature on or understanding for, because we're mostly concerned with the socialized versions of emotions. So concerned, in fact, we assume the socialized forms are the basic forms, so anything that isn't one of those is wrong to us, it's a disorder to us, because we don't even really understand these primal, unhewn, unadorned forms of these emotions. So sociopaths have no guidance or support from society, and their development has blocked them from being able intuitively to understand what they feel for themselves, so it's hard for them even to build their own literature or vernacular, let's say. And it's even worse because we're so convinced these socialized forms of emotions are the baseline. They also assume the socialized forms of emotions are the baseline, so it's like they invalidate their own feelings by default. Nobody is trying to understand their emotions on their terms, and they don't have the tools, at least by default, at least without a lot of work and study, and what are they going to study to develop these things? They have to build them for themselves, to understand and work with them themselves. So it is low affect, but it's worse than that. It's repressed and invalidated affect. Their feelings are these little confusing, strange things that get misunderstood and shit on and beaten by everybody, including themselves, until those emotions go crazy and make them do weird, fucked up stuff they don't understand. Even with their low affect, emotions, it's still useful to think about your emotions and different sides of yourself as people. These things can get so abused, even on mute, they still get really loud and overwhelming and overpowering. So I like the low affect moniker, because it makes it clear this is not a nemesis arrangement, and it's also not no affect. There is affect. It's just in the worst position affect can be in. And this is where the personal and the love side comes in. I think they can love. And I think they can love in a mutually fulfilling way. as long as you understand this difference between primal emotions and how odd those are, and socialized emotions, and also the position they're dealing with those primal emotions in, or from. And this is a big leap, but my nose and my stomach are telling me this is the case. In the past, I loved a sociopath and was loved by a sociopath. Now, our connection was wacky, but if love is a transaction, and I think it is, although we were coming from completely different positions, my needs were met and her needs were met. And the only real reason it didn't work out was one key point, which was whether or not to have children, which again, thinking back about all this, knowing now probably what I was dealing with, what we were dealing with, it's gruesome in the soul. She didn't want to do to her children what had been done to her, and what had been done to her wasn't very pretty. And also, the more I think about this gruesome brutality, I think she was a map. And thinking, trying to get into her mind now that I'm more aware, knowing herself and the way her urges work, and this and that, it's not just she didn't want to abuse her children, she didn't want to do really ugly things to her children. And if that is the case, and if my heart weren't twice hardened right now, although it needs to be 25 times hardened, we're getting there, I would be crying my eyes out. My point in this is, even without understanding what was going on, having no context for any of this, and also not having a schema to deal with her emotions and my emotions and figuring out how to make them work together, we got pretty far. And recent events reminded me what degree of love is out there. There is a way to do this, and it is worthwhile. When the bell tolls again and the ritual begins again, it would be way more convenient if for some reason I weren't attracted to these people. The only sorts of people who are offering the deal, the transaction I'm looking for. But I am, and they are, and even though it is confusing and inconvenient, there is a way to do this, and it is worthwhile. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't.